Okay. This gentleman here deserves some applause because he's the first brave soul to get in line to ask a question.
Is the microphone so you can hear me? Right? It's clear. Yes. Hello, Mr. Saunders. It's very nice. I'm very grateful for your very candid endorsement of entitlement and making it very clear that you're not endorsing Islam or you're not endorsing any particular religious dogma. The concern I have, the only concern I guess I do have, is that I feel that you have made a category mistake. And by that, what I mean is something that Mr. Jonathan K. brought up earlier about comparing the Muslims, immigrants to Western world, Canada or France or Italy or Norway in the past 15 to 20 years with the immigrants that came in 1960s perhaps from India, or perhaps the immigrants even before that from the Jewish people or the Catholics that came to North America. Now, the landscape Mr. Jonathan K. mentioned is very different than it was in 1950s because of the internet. You could be an immigrant in Toronto from Pakistan or Bangladesh or Somalia, and you have 5 or 6 children, and for you now there isn't that much incentive. It's more easier for you to hold on.
I love the fact that you went first, but you got to get a question going. Okay. Here we got a line up behind you.
Okay.
Let's go.
20 seconds, sorry. That now on the internet you could have sort of a imam or another sort of teacher from Islamabad or Lahore teaching your child how to recite the Quran, or other teachings of whatever Sunni Islam from Islamabad or Lahore is being broadcasted. How can you weigh that in your calculation, in your extrapolation, that the immigrants in Canada or the West from Pakistan or Bangladesh will also assimilate as the Indians did in 1960 or 17 and Catholics did before that and Jewish people before that?
Okay. Doug,
how do you account for that?
All I'm asking is whether I'm not trying to project too much, because I'm not a great believer in projections of the future, but I am looking at whether these groups are integrating. And I don't use the word assimilate, I use the word integrate, because I have a feeling that I haven't assimilated into Canadian culture yet. But by integration I mean inclusion in the educational and economic systems of the country, and some evidence of support and loyalty to the core values of the secular state and the laws and the values of equality and secularism and so on. And on the balance, I find that they are, with some alarming exceptions. There are things that you allude to that are side effects of this communications problem that are a worry. It is a problem that people from the more, shall we say, gentle practices of Islam, from the Mughal and Turkish practices, are often finding themselves going to mosques where the imam is Saudi or Egyptian and is practicing a much more ascetic version of the faith, and are becoming more conservative in that sense. That often has to do with some complicated things involving who's paying the salaries and so on, as well as communications networks. So there are issues within the communities. There are tides of belief and tides of different practices. I mean, Islam is as variegated a religion worldwide as Christianity.
I'm jumping in here. I'm going to urge both of you to be more economical.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, we got a long line.
Anyway. I am looking at it at an average across for a reason, because I'm combating people who do also look at an average.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you could comment briefly on the shift in Canadian foreign policy and the impact it's having on public attitudes in Canada. You might recall that I think it was a little over a year ago, the Prime Minister was interviewed by Peter Mansbridge on CBC, and he said that the biggest threat to Canadian national security was Islamism. And I'm quoting there. I want to congratulate you, Mr. Saunders, for your excellent piece in the Globe 2 weeks ago on Canada's decision to sever diplomatic ties with Iran. But I'm wondering, in the context of that recent decision, comments by the Prime Minister on national television, as he made a year ago, and if you could give me your sense on how this is affecting public attitudes in Canada, and does this mean we need more of what Doug Saunders has to say?
Thank you. It's going to be a little unpopular to say, but I actually think Stephen Harper deserves a certain amount of credit for keeping that sort of language and those sort of ideas basically out of his party and out of his government. And I know that there was some set of words during a CBC interview that set people off and so on, but nowhere in policy, including immigration policy, has there been any suggestion of a distrust of Muslims in Canada. We do not have a vocal corner of the Conservative Party who rail on in the Houses of Parliament about government officials being agents of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, as we do in the United States, in the House of Representatives and so on. We do not have prominent leadership candidates in the Conservative Party who will talk about stealth Sharia, as Newt Gingrich and probably 4 other candidates did during this leadership race. Not Mitt Romney, unfortunately. So I think you may politically disagree with them and so on, and you may suspect that there are backbenchers who harbor some of these intolerant ideas. But really, in Canada, across the political spectrum, this stuff's been kept out. I would make an exception of the provincial politics of Quebec, to be frank, where there has been some of that language lately, where the idea, and so on.
Next question, please.
On the topic of parents trying to teach their children traditional values, I work in education innovation and support very diverse schools with very diverse curricula. Is there any fear that that would lead to parents imposing very traditional curricula in schools on their kids and not assimilating?
I'm a new Canadian. I've just arrived fresh off the boat. And
how long were you away for?
8 years.
You were away for 8 years.
Yeah.
And now you're back.
And yes, and very good country. And, I'm going to hell. John, you've written about this, but schools and integration stuff more than I have. And what do you think?
Well, one thing is, we live in a jurisdiction, Ontario, where there's in terms of public education, there's a large degree of centralization of curricula and stuff like that, and it's very tightly controlled what you can teach and what you can't teach. Also, the limiting factor for a lot of parents in terms of sending their kids to private schools, religious or not, is money. It has nothing to do with religious doctrine because there's no tax credit for sending your kids. And it's actually interesting, the one time I've had meetings in the last few years where I've had Jewish and Muslim representatives arguing exactly the same case is on the subject of education. Because if you've got, I met a Jewish parent who had 4 kids in private school. He's spending $100,000 in after-tax income. And you could have a Muslim parent in exactly the same situation. So a lot of people, just for purely economic reasons, end up sending their kids to public schools. On the other hand, I've also had correspondence with public school teachers in Brampton, for instance, who say that there's this sort of cold war in their school between Muslim and Sikh and Hindu children. And a lot of them, despite their young age, are highly knowledgeable in the propaganda originating from their respective communities about stuff that's going on 10,000 miles away. However, I go back to the baseline. It's a very crude measure, but the greatest measure of do we have an integration problem in our society is, are people blowing stuff up? And in Canada and the United States, the answer is no. You have, if you go on social media, you have the very shrill discussions. You have, all kinds of arguments. You have, you listen to Punjabi. I don't speak Punjabi, but every time I read an article about Khalistani Sikhs, my Sikh friends say, "Oh my God, they were talking about you on Punjabi radio." But they talk about me on Punjabi radio, but that's a great thing. But it's, everybody knows where I work. Everybody.
No, if we're not blowing things up, does that mean it's okay? Can we add more diversity to the public school curricula, or have more different types of public schools?
I'm very skeptical of politically correct, heavy-handed efforts at imposing diversity. I think students are very cynical about it. I'm not sure that's the way to go. It has a bad odor about it because of political correctness efforts in the 1990s and such. But maybe Doug has a different view on that.
I'd rather not have diversity in schools. I'd rather have. I grew up in that sort of Helvetica age when Canadian institutions were all sort of white concrete buildings with signs in the same sort of Swiss typeface, and it's sort of that clean neutrality. This building was an example that I grew up with. Everyone went to the same school and so on, and I do think quite fundamentally that everyone should go to the same schools, and that people can develop cultural differences on their own, day by day or week by week or generation by generation, but I'm increasingly convinced that official efforts to define and create cultural differences are never a good idea. I've strangely, working on this book, I almost became against multiculturalism, but not in the way that Anders Behring Breivik and people like that I write about are. They were against the multi, and I'm against the culturalism.
Let's get the next one. Thank you, sir. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Sean Dalton, and I'm writing a book about the 3 myths of Canadian immigration. And you mentioned that the kids of immigrant parents assimilate and do better than the parents. However, Diane Francis wrote a book in 2002 called Immigration, the Economic Case, and there were schools all over Toronto and in parts of Peel where 16 out of the 25 kids in the school didn't speak English whatsoever, and the teachers were just overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do, and they felt paralyzed. So I'd like to point that out. The second thing I'd like to point out is Canada creates ethnic enclaves of people who segregate from the mainstream. Your own newspaper did a poll, and they asked the readers, is multiculturalism a failed policy? And 66% of respondents said it was. Over in Europe, Germany, France, the UK, and last year Holland declared the multicultural experiment a failure, going with the US melting pot model. And the best-selling author from Trinidad, who came to Canada in 1973, sold a book called Selling Illusions, The Cult of Multiculturalism. It was republished in 2002. And I want to know, based on next year's immigration policy, they're going to assess people for language and give them a job offer. Is that the right direction that Canada's headed in?
Thank you. Who wants it?
I'll take
Go,
it.
John.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned Neil Basundath's book, Selling Illusions, which I read. It came out in the mid-90s, and at the time, I think it was a very necessary book. Neil Basundath lived in Montreal at the time, and I think he was writing a corrective to the doctrinaire multiculturalism at the time. And that was what I call hard multiculturalism. It was a multiculturalism that says that all cultural practices are of equal value, regardless of how barbaric we may consider them. So for instance, there were people who were actually arguing that things like female genital mutilation was okay because in the cultures that they originated from, they considered it okay. That was hardcore cultural relativism, and Neil Basundath's book was in part a corrective to that, but we don't have that anymore. I don't know anybody who still embraces full-scale cultural relativism in that way. So I agree with you that those books were valuable. Diane Francis has done some valuable journalism, but that cultural moment has passed, and now, to my mind, I'm more concerned about the other, the folks like Breivik and stuff who are arguing the other side of the coin, which is such a violent argument against multiculturalism that they swing the cultural pendulum to the other side.
I agree with that. I think people that move to a country should learn about that country's history and embrace the culture completely and speak the language of the majority of the citizens.
But have you seen the citizenship test that Jason Kenney's put in place? Because it so happens that my nanny has actually taken the citizenship test, and she became a citizen last year. I'm being very bourgeois talking about my nanny, I realize, but I actually learned an extraordinary amount about the citizenship process, and I was delighted to go with her when she became a citizen. It was an extremely proud moment for her and her family, and the oath she took and the speech that the judge gave, this is out in Scarborough, was actually the sort of speech that would make a 1950s Canadian proud. It was all about leaving your ancestral struggles back at home in the old country. It's about being a Canadian. It's about being inclusive. It was given by a judge who was half Ontarian, half Métis. It was a very inspiring speech. The citizenship test that Jason Kenney's put in place is full of all the sorts of things that it sounds like you would be well disposed toward. The idea that we're living in a society where we don't expect new Canadians to adopt the language is a fantasy from from conservative tracts from the 1990s. We don't live in that in Canada anymore. And thanks in large part to Jason Kenney.
Sir, you're going to forgive me. You've got a long line of people who still want to get at it. You've had a supplementary already.
My kickboxing teacher came from China, and all his students went back there because they never spoke English and they felt alienated. He had to move his dojo twice in 5 years. So
Okay.
that's what happens when people don't, you know.
I look forward to your book.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi there. Thank you both very much for coming out tonight. It's an interesting feeling to learn a little more talking or listening to you two than in like 2 weeks of classes. And I promise I will ask you an actual question. Do you find, here is my question. Do you find the term honor killing creates an artificial divide between Muslims and non-Muslims in Western society? Why is it if my father killed my mother, it would be termed domestic violence, but in the Islamic community, it would be termed an honor killing? Where do you two personally draw the line between those two things?
I think it's. I'm not bothered by the term honor killing, because there is a specific. And look, this is extremely rare, and it makes the front page when it happens because of its rarity, and not in spite of it. But there is a specific thing where people with extremely intolerant cultural beliefs will actually kill a member of their family because their honor has been besmirched in some religious way. And yeah, of course, it's domestic violence. I mean, when a father kills his daughter, it's a crime known as domestic violence, and yeah, it's just plain murder and so on. But certainly, if religion is a factor in it, I don't mind it being described that way and so on. I mean, yeah, you could point out that more Christians were killed in Ontario by botched exorcisms during the last 10 years than Muslims killed by honor killings and so on, but that does not mitigate the problem with that. And it should be punished simply as a crime and so on. I don't think whether your motives were, you know, secular or religious is much of a mitigating factor if you kill a member of your family and so on. But I don't mind it being discussed that way. I do mind when there's a suggestion that this is something coming out of the mainstream beliefs of a lot of people, though, and so on. I think the people who do that are probably crazy, and the cases that I've read about tend to be people who come in as refugees from very troubled places and so on, not through the immigration system. And I would say probably whatever experience they went through, they go insane, and religion becomes an excuse for insanity sometimes.
John?
The book to read on this subject, in my opinion, from a Canadian perspective, is by a woman named Aruna Papp, who is a Canadian activist here in Toronto. She's of Indian extraction, and it's very interesting because she herself comes from a Seventh-day Adventist background, and she writes about honor killings that took place in India in the Seventh-day Adventist community. It is not strictly a Muslim phenomenon, although statistically it is primarily Muslim because of the regions of the world where it takes place. It takes place in Christian communities, it sometimes takes place in Hindu communities. However, I do think there's an important distinction to be made between garden variety domestic violence killings and honor killings. Garden variety domestic violence killings typically take place in mutually violent domestic relationships where there's alcohol abuse, where there's a long-standing pattern of battery, man against woman. Sometimes there's mental health issues, joblessness, there's the whole cocktail of these sort of things. And it usually involves one person, it usually involves a man beating a woman. Honor killings are completely different. They typically involve a conspiracy, well-planned, by people who aren't drunk or have serious mental health issues. It usually involves in-laws, it involves multiple family members. We saw this in the Aqsa Parvez case. And the factors involved are completely different from those involving garden variety domestic abuse. It's not dysfunctionality and substance abuse. It is a conspiracy that is based on the cultural idea that a family's honor can be safeguarded by killing a woman who breaches an honor code. And I don't think these people are crazy, because they have made a rational calculation that the preservation of their family's honor is a form of capital that they need to retain, and the best way to retain it is by exterminating the woman. And it is completely different from ordinary domestic violence.
Thank you.
Next question.
I was reading this piece in The Economist it was a couple months ago, and I apologize for quoting stats that I vaguely remember from a couple months ago. But what it looked at was that in America, when you exclude 9/11, that more acts of terrorism had been committed in the name of right-wing extremism, however you want to define that, than had been done in the name of Islam. And of course, the article said, well, we should address that more. And it seems to me, and this is somewhat opinion-y, when Anders Breivik kills a bunch of people, we talk about how insane Anders Breivik is and less about his ideology. And it turned out, according to the courts, that he's not insane. And, but there is a lot of right-wing extremism, people like Timothy McVeigh, guy who killed a bunch of Sikhs recently. This happens, but it seems again, I apologize, it's a question mixed with opinion, but it seems that with other forms of extremism, we put it on the individual, and the question is, what's wrong with this individual? Whereas it happens with Islam, it's treated like a homogenous thing. Why, assuming you agree with my assertions, when it's Islam, it's a homogenous issue, and when it's other forms of extremism, it's always focused on the individual?
You agree with this premise? Do we do that?
Jihadist, or whatever you want to call it, terrorism, Islamic extremist terrorism, is a pretty rare phenomenon in both Europe and North America, compared to other forms of extremist terrorism. I mean, in Europe, most terrorism is of the nationalist or domestic political variety. In the United States, there have been so few cases that it's hard to measure it against the background noise of other forms of terrorism. That doesn't mean it isn't a very specific threat and problem that needs to be faced by law enforcement agencies and so on. Do we treat it differently? I think one of the things I'm addressing is that there is a belief that it's arising out of ordinary religious beliefs rather than being a very separate political movement. I mean, one thing we know from all of the statements made by every Islamic extremist terrorist from Osama bin Laden downward is that they're not really religious proselytizers who are using their violence to try to convert people. Which would be a particularly ineffective technique, by the way. They are people who believe in a land of Islam and in the honor of this geographical space and believe it's been besmirched or invaded in some ways and believe that there is a civilizational war and that it's worthwhile to commit violence against civilians in order to further this. So it's a fringe thing. I think because it's new and because it's alarming, it does get more attention and probably deserves to in certain ways. And I think they were right not to judge Breivik as being insane, but as being, look, anyone who commits this is insane in some ways. I mean, I think John and I are using the word insane in slightly differently, but
you're in the same place.
In the criminal court's definition, to be judged criminally insane, you have to show that you are not able to recognize the law, essentially, that you're not cognizant of that. Anyone able to carry out an act of terrorism usually has enough mental functioning going on to know what the law is.
Part of my job here this evening is to make sure we stay on time. So we've got time for 2 more questions. The gentleman and then the lady behind him, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to pull the plug at that point. So go ahead, sir.
Hey, thanks for coming out. I'm a big fan of both of you guys. You talked a little bit earlier about how failure for integration often is a fault of the host country. Point out to examples such as Turks in Germany versus in Britain. What sort of policies do you think that governments can promote, either in terms of citizenship, immigration, economic policies, criminal policies, that positively promote integration?
This is a crucial question, right? And I think generally immigrant communities vaguely want to integrate in some ways. People do not like being excluded outsiders. People do not really come to a country thinking, I'm going to ghettoize myself off to the side and be much poorer than everyone else and live in a bad neighborhood. That's generally not the aspiration. Sometimes people don't because they really don't know how to work the system and the system doesn't help them work it and they get stuck. Sometimes they become because they're expecting an economic opportunity that doesn't exist and so on. Sometimes in ways that I've written about elsewhere because the physical spaces of cities mean that the places where immigrants first arrive are disconnected physically and economically in ways that leave them stuck and so on. There's ways to overcome that. The barriers in the way of integration are physical sometimes. If you're stuck up in an apartment block neighborhood 12 bus rides away from the city, it can be bad for you. And I'd actually say the kids who are in that Al-Qaeda cell based out of Meadowvale were subject a little bit to that. There are citizenship problems that we discussed before. If you deny, the most dangerous thing for a country is to have a group of people living on a long-term basis in your midst who have no pathway to full legal citizenship, because that prevents them from investing in their communities, from buying houses, going to university, doing all the things that we call integration.
John, you want a word on this?
And there are
as well?
educational things as well.
I think that sums it up.
Okay. Thank
Thanks.
you for the question. Last one. Thank you.
My question isn't very different from that one, actually. I was just wondering what type of policies do you think, have you seen work in other areas of the world that you think that Canada should potentially model? And the other question is, I'm an urban planner, so I'm interested in this relationship between your first book and this book, and how we can actually use space to promote integration.
I've spent a good amount of time looking at the European cities that are so often described as being, no-go zones and so on. And some of them are. Some of them are troubled neighborhoods and so on. One of the things I look at toward the end of this book is a neighborhood where I spent several months last year just north of the train station in Antwerp that had become a troubled place. I mean, a lot of the Moroccan and Turkish youth had fallen into crime, sometimes into religious extremism, and it was a failed place. And just to cut to the quick on this, I realized after spending a while there that what it reminded me of, and it reminded me of the part of East London known as Tower Hamlets, or Brick Lane in the popular imagination now, when I first lived there briefly in the 1980s for a couple of years when I was 19 and 20 years old. And that was a dangerous neighborhood that you didn't go to at night very much, that had gangs, it had riots, it had people protesting in favor of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, all this very alarming, isolated civilization sort of stuff going on, as well as poverty and disease and all that. And somehow it, over 25 years, changed. It became the place where everybody wants to go. It became what's widely regarded as a successful integration story, and so on. It turned around partly because of time and economic growth, frankly, but also partly because of some smart policies in particularly education. I mean, the putting of expensive charter schools in those neighborhoods that the business community invested in, and that were better than the schools, not just better than the schools in immigrant neighborhoods, but were better than the schools in the rich neighborhoods, so that the immigrant kids in the neighborhood were no longer competing to get out of school quickly enough, but actually had to compete to get into their own neighborhood school. It was very good. There were a bunch of policies that worked very well. And I'd say that we have a suite of ideas coming from the more successful cities that should be examined sort of in terms of best practices by those places that think they're just stuck with bad immigrants.
John, you want a final word tonight?
I live in Broadview, Danforth. 50 years ago, if you went to Broadview, Danforth, you'd hear a lot of Greek. And the area, I think, was mostly Greek at that time. The churches were Greek Orthodox, and it was a ghetto, as we would now define the term. Now, if you go there, I think the Greek population is something like 10%. A lot of these people have migrated out to the suburbs. They cashed out at ridiculous prices. Yeah, and they're just laughing all the way to the bank. But you still see you see a residue of the Greek there. You see the restaurants, and you do see some Greek residents there. But if Doug is right, 20 or 30 years ago from now, we'll be seeing the same pattern in areas in Europe, Canada, the United States, which are now primarily Muslim. And I think for a rational analysis of that, I think his book is a very good place to start.
As I invite Tina to come up and close it off tonight, I thought these guys, for a couple of nerdy newspaper guys, did pretty well here. What do you think? Thanks very much. That was good. Thanks, very good. Thanks, that was fun. Well done. Well done.